Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Suzanne Jeffrey from the Campaign Against Climate Change, who've also produced this pamphlet, will be kicking us off. So I'm going to hand over to Suzanne.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Nadia, and thanks, comrades and friends and colleagues, for coming to the meeting today. So our meeting is fighting for climate justice and system change, and I think really the start point for our discussion needs to be the need for system change. And I think we have to assert that right at the very beginning. It needs to run through our understanding of the strategic challenges that are ahead of us if we are in any way, shape or form to address the urgency of the climate catastrophe that is with us as we speak. And why do I say that? Well, you know, this issue is not a new issue. Over the last 50 plus years, from the first Earth Summit in 1972 in Stockholm to COP26 in Glasgow of last year, there has been a reoccurring dissonance between an increasingly clear and urgent scientific and societal need for urgent change and a continuation of business as usual, or usually more commonly turbocharging business as usual neoliberal capitalist agenda, prioritising profit and the anarchy of the market over people, the planet, over democratic planning, over the changes that we need to address the climate crisis. And that's been the reality of the last 50 years. And it is worth repeating. For 50 years, there has been absolutely clear, unequivocal scientific and societal evidence of the changes that we need to make. And through those 50 years, at every turn, when a new report comes out with even greater urgency, the direction of those in power, the elites, the global elites in the world, has not been to address those issues, but has been actually to move us in a direction which makes the problem worse, because they have prioritised profit and the market over people and the environment and the planet that we live on, to the extent that we now face, you know, a crisis of extinction, which is absolutely, you know, terrifying. I'll just give you one example, as though, you know, one example is not enough, but it is a useful example if we just think about the most recent conference, COP26. We're only 7 months away from that conference, hosted by Johnson's government, a closing plenary in which Alex Sharma tearfully acknowledged that they hadn't, although the British government, he asserted, had been doing an awful lot, but that generally they hadn't met everything they'd hoped to achieve at that summit. And that was obviously a load of, you know, empty rhetoric from Sharma, and no doubt empty crocodile tears as well. But even on their own commitments, even on their own weak and pathetic commitments from 7 months ago, what has happened in the meantime? Well, absolutely nothing. And worse than nothing has happened in the meantime. So even their own advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change, just last week produced a report that fears the government will renege on the legally binding commitments that it made to net zero by 2050. That's what their fears are. They do tend to have a finger on the pulse in terms of what some of their friends in government are planning to do. The CCC described the government as having major policy failures, scant evidence of delivery, and of course we know that also in that time the war in Ukraine has been used as an excuse to justify a return to a fossil fuel agenda that they never wanted to leave in the first place, that they are now ploughing more money into and allowing oil and gas companies to further exploit, and the much heralded windfall tax that they had to introduce under pressure from the movement actually was a windfall tax only in name, because for every £1 out of those enormous profits that the oil and gas companies are going to have to pay, we are giving them back from taxpayers' money 90p. For every £1 that they pay in a windfall tax, we are giving them 90p back for further investment in oil and gas, in explorations, new explorations, or in projects that were already going to go ahead. So we are essentially paying for those projects whilst we need to keep every ounce of fossil fuels in the ground. And of course we know there is talk of fracking, a return to the fracking agenda in the UK. The one very significant success that our climate movement's had. There's not one fracking well in the UK, and they're desperately going to push ahead with it under the excuse that this will somehow tackle our cost of living crisis. And of course, we know it won't. It won't tackle the cost of living crisis, and it won't absolutely tackle the climate crisis, and thus it goes on. So if you just want one example, that's one example. There are many, many more of the failure, the absolute failure, and therefore of the urgent need. Oh, I want to give you one more example. And of course, the government's obsession with nuclear. The civil and nuclear programme, which we are told again is coming in online in order to help us with our cost of living crisis and tackle the climate crisis. It will do neither. The civil nuclear programme is the most expensive form of energy going, the most expensive form of energy going. We are yet again going to subsidise this, and the civil nuclear programme has got nothing to do with tackling the climate crisis or the cost of living crisis, and everything to do with maintaining a military nuclear programme in this country, while the UK postures on the world stage as some kind of great global leader. So this system, and those who support it, will repeat their relentless drive to climate catastrophe consistently, systematically, relentlessly, and will not change. And therefore we do need systemic change. We need an end to this system, and for so many reasons, but fundamentally, we need an end to this system to reorganise society to urgently address the climate and ecological crisis. So, our ability to do that, how do we bring a system change? So, I just want to add a couple of thoughts to the discussion, and hope that I know that the rest of my panel will contribute on that, and also I hope that there's a good discussion from the audience on that as well. So, our ability to tackle the climate crisis, one of many interconnected crises deriving from a system prioritising profit over people, rests on the strength of our movement and and the capacity of social class with power capable of challenging the dynamic of capitalism through power that can pose an alternative to the system. So that's essentially what our ability to tackle this, to bring about system change rests on. The capacity of a movement, the capacity of social class, the power of the working class to pose an alternative to this system. And the current rise in workers' struggles, I would say, is absolutely crucial to achieving that. So is maintaining a significant and powerful climate movement, and so are the nature of the demands and the programmes that emerge from both from those workers' struggles and from the climate movement. And a rise in workers' struggles and strikes over pay in the last few months has reminded us that the working class have power. We have been reminded very physically, very viscerally, that actually this whole sort of academic agenda, is it, that we were told over the last 30 years, that classes disappear, that working class people no longer have power to change the system. We can see, even with the smallest of glimpses over the last few months, we do have power. We have power to challenge the priorities of the system. We have power through collective action to demand a change, to demand difference, to demand a turn away from the race to the bottom that we've experienced in the last 30 or 40 years. So it's a huge opportunity, and it's an opportunity also to integrate the struggles, to strengthen the workers' movement by fighting for a wider set of demands, which also address our conditions of work, but also address the wider crises that we face as working people. And one of those crises, of course, is the climate crisis. It's a huge opportunity as we see this rise in struggle to integrate, a sort of set of demands. That address these wider crises. I think it's also, I'm going to have to jump ahead, I also think it's a huge opportunity to root those demands, and the obvious one, of course, is public transport, because I'm having to I need to go a little bit faster than I expected. The obvious one is public transport. Whilst we see rail workers, out on the streets demanding pay and a control over the technology that's imposed on them, the obvious demand that we want to integrate into that is really we also need a decent public transport system, accessible, cheap, affordable, free if possible. That also is addressed, and that needs to be peopled with workers. real workers who are doing real jobs to make a public transport system work and work well. And that will also address our climate crisis, because transport emissions are 27% of our emissions. We have working class communities that are either forced into cars, further accentuating the climate crisis, or stuck in their homes, isolated, elderly people who cannot leave because there is no public transport system to allow them access to participate in society. So that's what I mean by dragging those climate demands into the workers' movement, and also dragging the climate movement to stand in solidarity with the workers' movement. Now, I do not have time to say all of what I would have said, but I want to say this, I want to finish on this. It's also a huge opportunity to root the demands of the workers' movement in climate justice and international solidarity, and away from and bring a challenge to these false solutions that are constantly being presented to us as solutions to the climate crisis. Now, I just want to raise one, is the question of biofuels. And it may sound a bit esoteric and abstract, but we are facing a hunger crisis, a food crisis, which is about to get very, very, very horrible and vicious and nasty for large parts of the global population, particularly in North Africa and in the Middle East, because of the war in Ukraine, and therefore we see the lack of grain leaving from that. Now, whilst we also are experiencing that, what we also have is, because there's drive to business as usual, we've seen in the last 20 years a drive to biofuels. So we see large amounts of land being changed in terms of agricultural use in order to allow a large tract of lands to grow biofuels to feed the cars, the trucks, the aeroplanes. That's where they want to go with it. In other words, to feed a business as usual agenda, instead of transforming our economy to create a public transport system globally. They're instead determined to maintain a business as usual. And even at this very moment in time when we face a hunger crisis, there's no move away from that ploughing loads of resources into biofuels. In fact, there's an encouragement to do more and more of that at a time when people will not have food on their plates. So these are issues of climate justice. They are issues of social justice. These are not separate demands. These should inform us in terms of our climate movement, in terms of our workers' movement. We have to fight for a workers' movement that has climate demands at its heart, and climate and social justice at its heart. We have to fight for a climate movement that has workers and social justice demands at its heart. And united together, we stand a chance of tackling the most serious crisis that our class has ever faced.
For kicking off this session. I'm going to bring in now Gyekye Tanoh, who is an African socialist and somebody who is a member of our international socialist tendency as well. So if everyone could give a big welcome to Gyekye.
Yeah, thank you very much, and great to be here, and great to stand here. Actually hides my pot belly a bit, which is a form of kwashiorkor, in case you didn't know. The issue of climate change, as Suzanne has said, as no doubt all of you are aware, is one that is existential for everybody. Nonetheless, it's not an existential crisis that is coming, it is a crisis that is here. Because for a lot of people in the world, as the latest IPCC report shows, the kind of crisis that we're facing is in the immediate future and is already unfolding for those kinds of people. So what did the IPCC say? That's the International Panel on Climate Change, bodies of eminent scientists and so on, not, delusional radicals like myself and so on, right? One of the things they said is that by 2030, that's in 7.5 years, they project that 50% of all African cities will not have running water. 250 million people in Africa will be without water. That will cascade into a displacement of 700 million people in Africa. That is more than half the population of the entire continent. That's 8 years from now. Now, if you look at the appalling difference between the treatment of Ukrainian refugees, although it hasn't been that great for them either, to be honest, okay, but by and large, at least in terms of the official rhetoric, and you look at the way in which the far right governments like Boris Johnson and co are whipping up the question of immigration, of asylum, of racism, and so on, can you imagine what that means? 700 million people being displaced with nowhere to go. We're looking at a crisis that is staring us right in the face. It speaks directly to the point that Suzanne made about the necessity of building popular movements from below, which are cross-cultural, anti-racist, and so on and so forth. Putting the question of social rights and so on right in the heart of the movement, along with economic justice and so on. So how do we get that? First and foremost, the IPCC represents, as I said, part of the establishment itself. But the establishment hasn't done a great deal. And COP26 and what the man is, Shana and all those Johnson characters, well, what can you expect? But nonetheless, there are real figures at the top. There's ways in which these are undeniable, emergencies that confront humanity. So that the pledges have been made about how to actually bail out, help mitigate, help repair some of the losses that and the damage that people in the global south and elsewhere are encountering already. What are some of those promises? There's a commitment, for example, for a global climate fund, which is supposed to, the pledges up to 100 billion. This was made, I think, in 2009 in Copenhagen, if I'm right. $100 billion to help poorer countries of the global south to adapt, to mitigate, and also hopefully to repair some of the loss and damage that has occurred. Very little has gone into that fund, almost only about 4 billion or so. Now compare that to the subsidies, the handouts that are given to the fossil fuel companies, as Suzanne was saying. So relying on the mechanism that has been established by the conference of parties is something that I think will be a mistake. Nonetheless, the reason why it's important to say what the IPCC said is that the establishment is also split. That's one consideration that we have to put in mind. It's important to say that because fighting for reforms in the here and now are both possible and I think necessary, except they're inadequate. But it's important to assess that fighting for reforms is something that ought to be. Because, for example, if indeed there is a mechanism that can ensure that this question of loss and damage for people who are, dispossessed today, people whose livelihoods are destroyed, people whose houses are destroyed, and this is happening already, as I said. I mean, 2017, for example, the cyclone Idai in Mozambique, you found that the second city of the country was 90% destroyed. 300,000 residences totally damaged, 100,000 wiped out completely. Agricultural livelihoods in a 100 square kilometer area gone. Livestock drowned, and so on and so forth. So basically, the cycle between extreme weather events, drought, flooding, and so on, are intensifying as we speak. It is the case that we see in East Africa as well, where an historic drought combined with violent, unpredictable rain patterns means that tens of millions of people and an invasion of locusts, among all others, means that tens of millions of people depend on food aid. There's destitution. There's immense conflict emerging within those societies themselves. Sometimes along ethnic lines, sometimes along religious lines, and so on. This is the case in the length and breadth of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And you take a country like Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy, so to speak. The most the most highly populated country in Africa, where the conflict between pastoralists, those who depend on herding livestock for their livelihood, and settled agricultural communities, is medrous, utterly medrous. So we are staring not simply suffering, but we are staring the degradation of capacities to fight, unless there's an agenda, a radical agenda that can confront this question head on. Unless there's measures to redistribute, unless there's measures to engage in reparations, the kinds of things that will enable the loss and damage to actually be dealt with. So when there's pressure on, let's say, critiques that are emerging within the context of COP, those who might have watched what happened in Glasgow, for example, might remember the Prime Minister from Barbados, okay, who gave he's a Prime Minister, but gave a wonderful critique about what was happening, about the hypocrisy, about the fraud, about the profiteering, and so on and so forth. Something that hasn't gone away. Last time when the G7 met a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that they said to address poverty and climate change in the global south is to launch a new massive infrastructure development program. What they mean is, to control infrastructure for themselves and for their companies and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, positioning this as a direct competition to displace Chinese influence in that. In other words, even the necessities of life, apart from profiteering on them through mad-hat PFI schemes, internationalized and put on steroids, is the fact that these are sites of conflict, geopolitical conflict, imperial penetration, imperial, destabilization, and so on and so forth. That comes out of that. So when the Prime Minister of Barbados makes that kind of critique, what it tells us is that there are sections of the establishment where at least the analysis, the narratives can be challenged, and where some degree of reforms can be. It's important to say so because of the focus that a lot of climate activists have on that. But it's important to say that is thoroughly inadequate as well, because, for example, this same Prime Minister of Barbados, what was their solution? She says we need to finance climate finance that will depend on issuing bonds. Climate bonds to fight. Now, bonds are exactly one of those esoteric new financial assets, securities, and so on, which have plunged many, parts of both the global north and the global south, and working people into destitution, have sucked in pension funds, are sucking in all kinds of, financial surpluses, are engendering all kinds of speculation and so on. So even as we point to the fact that we have to make challenges in parliament, we have to make challenges in the media and so on, we have to kind of ensure that the split and the hypocrisy that exists in the global north in particular, but across the ruling classes especially is exposed, we still have to say it's not enough. It's not enough because the agenda of fighting for any kind of reform also requires us to radicalize and revolutionize those reforms. When you look at the situation that exists in Equatorial Africa, for example, existence is almost impossible. Okay, we're looking at a situation where within a few years, 25% of the coastal areas will be uninhabitable in many parts of Africa and the global south. Those are also areas in which there's still immense untapped resources in terms of fossil fuels and so on. So when we look at the question of the demands that we ought to make, those demands have to be those that hit financial monopolies and the priorities that they have. Cancel debt, for example. If you can cancel debt, start with Ukraine. Globalize that across the global south. Bring that into households who are confronting all kinds of debt and so on and so forth. Because on that basis, you can begin to localize demands as well as give them the necessary international dimension as well. Take over the multinational companies that actually dominate the fossil fuel industries. Nationalize them, but nationalize them under whose control? Because if it is under the control of people like Modi in India, if it is under the control of people like Ramaphosa in South Africa, the existing ruling class of Bolsonaro in Brazil or whatever it is, the existing ruler, that will be another disaster altogether. These are people who are intent on drilling more and take great pleasure when people like Mary Robinson talk about the fact that Africa and the global south should be given the leeway to continue to exploit their fossil fuels because they are not the polluters. They have real needs. There's no energy, there's no electricity, and so on and so forth. Now, again, it's not something that you dismiss out of hand because that disparity is something that we cannot remove our attention from. The fact that the polluters have gained and those who haven't polluted are paying is something that we cannot remove our eye from. But at the same time, we ought to be able to say that these are measures that have to weaken the ruling class, these are measures that have to weaken capital, and these are measures that have to be part and parcel of ensuring a rapid transition. Comrades, the fact is that short of revolution, the real solution to climate change won't happen. Short of revolution and short of revolutionary politics, a politics that ensures that communities are not divided because of the central notion of class, because of the possibility of uniting people in struggle, short of a revolution which says that the priorities of public expenditure have to be radically reorganized, short of revolutionary politics which demands local government and institutions that are run by local people in the here and now, we're not going to get very far. Now, comrades, the length and breadth of the global south, people are fighting back. It's not simply misery, it's not simply conflict, and so on and so forth. It is very easy for a continent where people are being dumped. They've dumped 2 seconds. The flotsam and jetsam that the system has chewed out, displaced, dehumanized, being dumped as human waste in Rwanda, in Africa. We see that. That's not the only thing being dumped. You have all the tons of e-waste and so on, and the conditions of the garbage workers and so on. In the revolutionary organization that I belong in Ghana, for example, garbage and e-waste pickers have joined it. They are the first to understand the radical need to internalize the question of climate change. They are the first to understand that the means by which you implant this in the working class include tying it to the agenda that Suzanne was talking about in terms of building wages, building trade union power, taking it into the communities and so on. They are the first to understand that when you pick up the kind of slogans that climate justice activists have, that you have to have hubs of organizers and activists in every workplace, in every community, in every college, they understand that perfectly well. Comrades, when that happens, the passivity, the victimhood, the only way that you can go ahead by turning against your neighbor, all of that is radically pushed aside. And those are the things that we must look to. It requires a radical class perspective. It requires a radical anti-racism. It requires a radical internationalism. But above all, it requires revolutionary socialist politics. Thank you, comrade.
Thank you, Gyekye. I'm going to bring in our final speaker now, who's Asad Rehman, who's from the War on Want campaign.
Thank you. And for those of you who don't know War on Want, we're the labour movement's organisation founded by the labour movement. We work to support workers in struggle, both here in the UK and globally, and work directly with social movements all around the world, fighting against the root causes and drivers of these injustices that we see. And I want to just maybe start by saying, first of all, solidarity with all UCU and the workers here at QMW who are fighting against job losses and for decent pay. You know, often I'm always told, well, thinking, our call for system change, it's utopian. This is utopian thinking to think about system change. That somehow we're always told we have to live and work within this system. Right? That's what real pragmatic politics around climate crisis is. And you know, the reality, as we all know, is the only people who say you have to live and work within this system are the people who aren't dying from this system. And I always pause back to the people, not here as a left audience, but to the right and to the liberals, is what is your answer to this crisis, to this intersectional crisis? How do you plan to be able to resolve this? Because we've got to think, right, what is our goal? If our goal is the right of everybody in the world to be able to live with dignity, and for us to be able to live with dignity and harmony with the planet, then we've got to ask ourselves, as we've heard, we know the impacts that are happening all around the world. You remember they're happening at just over 1 degree warming, right? That's the devastating killer floods, fires, famines, the huge economic losses that are happening all over the world. And those are happening. And I just want to say something about how neoliberalism has shaped climate responses. This 2-degree target that was first propagated and pushed by mainstream environmentalism and by governments. It came from a classic neoliberal economist. He said 2 degrees was what he called a reasonable amount of global warming. And he got a Nobel Prize. He got a Nobel Prize for saying that his cost-benefit analysis of the climate crisis, that actually the optimum level is a 4-degree warming of the planet. Now, you're only able to do that if you actually begin to actually say, there's half the world who we will sacrifice in the pursuit of what? And we all know in the pursuit of absolute profit. And I've always say, you know, the imagery that's sometimes used in climate about, you know, we're all on the Titanic. And of course, we are all on the Titanic. We're all being affected. But the reality, as we know, is that the elites, the corporate elites, that are political leaders, are still on the deck of the Titanic. They still think there's going to be some miraculous technological answer that's going to save them. And they're still listening to the orchestra, sipping cocktails. And it's the people in the movements, and it's the people of the global south, and it's the poor in the bottom of the Titanic already drowning. Now, when we think about temperature levels, and we say that no temperature level is safe, and it's deadly for many, well, how are they going to tackle the climate crisis when we already know what the scientists have told us? Within 5 years, we'll have breached for the first time 1.5 degree global warming, and that within a decade and a half, we'll have potentially gone over 2 degrees. And we're currently heading towards a warming of a planet, if every single pledge is met by every government, of 2.7 degrees warming. What is their answer to be able to that? And of course, the reason why they're able to argue that is not because they don't know about the climate crisis. It's incredible, actually. If you think back, 1,200 years before BC, the Greeks they'd already said that if you cut down forests and drain swamps, it affects rainfall in your region. In the 18th century, we had a scientist already saying that actually burning coal and carbon was going to lead to an increase in temperature. And in 1948, not in 1992, not in 1948, the fossil fuel companies were already financing reports about the link between fossil fuels and pollution. And they already were being told that it will lead to a sea level rise, it would lead to melting of the polar ice caps, it would lead to huge impacts in terms of around food production, it would devastate people's lives, etc. And of course, they buried those reports, and they buried them, of course, because they were interested in their absolute profit. Now, when you think about the scale of that, I say, well, so what have you done? Those people who believed you could do this within the system, how is it, after 40 years of multilateral negotiations, we're nowhere closer to be able to tackling the climate crisis? How is it that working within the system has managed to be able to do that? And of course, the reality is because it's incompatible to be able to tackle the climate crisis within the logic of capitalism. That's its ultimate contradiction. It's not that these people don't sit there at UN meetings and say, I'm a climate denialist. They actually believe them. They know that climate change is real. But that is the fundamental problem that they've got, is this contradiction. And why? Of course, because BP, Exxon and Shell, just in the last couple of decades, have posted $2 trillion in profit. 2 trillion. The BP CEO says fossil fuels is a cash machine. It's a cash machine, is why. And today, when you think about our energy system, and people always say, look, the good news, renewable energy, it's taking off. Listen, 90% of all energy that powers our current economic system all around the world is based on carbon. 90% of it. Has that shifted? No. We've got solar, which is about 2.4%. We've got wind about 1.7%. And we've got hydro about 7%. If they've not been able to shift that in 40 years, how are they going to shift it within 5 years? How are they going to shift it within 10 and 15 years? And of course, it's impossible for them to be able to do that. And this is a world where, of course, half the world, 3.5 billion people, don't have access to electricity or clean cooking. And even in the richest countries now, people can't afford to pay to heat their homes. That's the contradiction they cannot answer. And so, of course, the answer, we should shift away from fossil fuels, we'll divest from fossil fuels, as if these fossil fuel companies overnight is going to do these things. And as much as we can see these adverts on BP and Shell and their net zero 2050, what they're doing at this moment is they're plowing over $100 million every single day into expanding fossil fuels. The ultra-conservative International Energy Association, this is the ultra-conservative energy association, said there can be no expansion of any oil, gas or coal if you want to limit temperatures to below 1.5. We have to keep 80% of all known reserves in the ground if you want to be compatible to keep the limited temperatures. Are we anywhere near that? No, of course not. We've got the UK government, we've got the US government, we've got the European Union, all announcing massive expansions of fossil fuels. Why? Do they not know about the climate crisis? Of course they know about the climate crisis, because fundamentally what they're trying to do is be able to... Oh, fucking hell, 2 minutes. I've not even got to all the rest of the stuff. Because, look, yes, the fossil fuel companies are the baddies. And that's all really, really good. But the baddies only operate because of a system, right? And when our government, at this very same moment, is signing trade agreements with investor-state dispute settlement courts in them, which allow fossil fuel companies to sue governments if governments take any action that affects their profit, then we know that it's not just the fossil fuel companies we have to shift, it's our economic system as well. And the reality... Look, and this is not ideological. The IPCC report said it is impossible to tackle the climate crisis without tackling poverty and inequality at the same time. You need a compact on poverty and inequality. We have a world where half the world is surviving on less than $5.50 a day, without access to public services, social protection. Now, these aren't just nice things to have. They are the critical determinants of how people survive and are impacted by the climate crisis. And now you have climate scientists saying you need public services, you need social protection, you need living wages for people to be able to deal with the climate crisis. We've heard, our Prime Minister talk about the food crisis because of what's happening in Ukraine. It's incredible. They talk about the food crisis, Well, we know what the solution to the food crisis is. We can feed the world 3 times over. It's called land rights. It's called agroecology. It's called giving control of food back to people. The reality is all of the food, 80% of the world's population, are fed on less than 20% of land. The rest of the land is handed over to commodities. Commodities that our capitalist system has embedded and forced the global south to be able to produce because it needs to feed this unsustainable growth and the profit accumulation that goes along with it. It's simply impossible to tackle the climate crisis without doing that. And the reality is now you've got the UN Special Rapporteur saying, we are on the brink of climate apartheid, where the rich will use their wealth to seek safety and leave the poor to burn. This is not us as radicals saying that. This is what the UN is also saying. And it's also saying, to be able to address this climate crisis, you need to undo those systems of injustice. And you know what it names as the systems of injustice? It names it as colonialism and its modern day aspects of colonialism. It is exactly what we know. How is it that the global south has handed over not just billions but trillions, 4.5 trillion in unsustainable debt payments since 1980, 16 trillion in capital flows that flowed from the global south to the global north. And from India alone during the British Raj, 45 trillion looted during the colonial period. And this is the wealth that has gone not just into every brick and mortar and building of this country, but of course to enrich the elite. And we could see that over this last year. Do you remember the G7 when it was here in the UK? President Biden and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, we're going to build back better. We'll build back better after the COVID crisis. Less money has been spent on the low-carbon economy than was spent even in the 2008 financial crisis, where they handed trillions to their corporate thing. Remember when no one is safe until everyone is safe about the COVID vaccine? And yet the reality is, of course, we have our own government blocking a people's vaccine. Why? Because big pharmaceutical companies are making $1 million in profit each and every second. That's why it's incompatible and it's impossible to tackle this climate crisis by believing that you can do it within the capitalist system. Look, the reality is you need a new economic model, one model that puts well-being at the heart of it. It challenges the idea of unsustainable growth. It actually challenges the very notion of capitalist thinking, and that's what this moment provides us. Now, that's not just a utopian idea. Of course, we've got to populate it with those transitional demands. So our vision of what a radical global Green New Deal, that does 4 things. Yes, it limits its temperature to well below 1.5 by making food and energy a right for absolutely everybody, a fundamental right for all of us, equitably shared, controlled by people. It means making sure living wages, not just in the UK, but we're fighting throughout all the supply chains for the global south as well. And we know we can do that. It means living within planetary limits. At the moment, we're about to double the amount of resources we take out of the planet, when at the very same time the scientists are telling us we have to massively reduce the amount of materials we take out of the planet. We have to put planetary limits in there. And of course, none of this is impossible without undoing those systems. And it's the systems we know of racism and patriarchy that go back from the doctrine of discovery to slavery to colonialism and imperialism, which has said that half the world could be sacrificed because they're poor, they're black, they're brown, they're indigenous, or they're women. That's what you've got to tackle, that logic of that, and that's deeply embedded within all of this new form of green capitalism, because they do have an answer. Their answer is, well, okay, capitalism hasn't worked. You know what we'll do? Let's commodify absolutely everything. Let's try and put a value on everything. You either have value or you don't have value. If you have value, we'll be going to be able to trade you. We'll have offsets. We'll have carbon markets, none of which have worked. Even if they worked, even if we were ideologically not opposed to them, but even if they worked, I'd be able to say, okay, fine, at least there's something happening. They're tinkering. They're tinkering because they know that there's no alternative but the system change. Look, the reality, as we all know and we've heard, is change is coming. It's inevitable now. The only fight we have got now is what kind of change is going to come? Who's going to benefit? Who will suffer and who will be sacrificed? That's why this is the most critical fight for us. To be able to build our power, we need to be able to connect our issues, connect our demands and connect our movements. When it's like the climate crisis, we talk about intersectional links. That's not a luxury. It's the necessity to be able to understand that. And that's us as internationalists. It's why we are so critical. Because the answer to this moment is solidarity. The most important word in the vocabulary of the working class. What is it? It's most important now, cooperation and internationalism. And who holds that? We hold that. not the right, not the liberals, not those people. We progressive people, we are the ones who embody those ideas, that we don't talk about the nation state. We talk about our class being global. And that's why it's so critical now for socialists to be at the forefront of this fight on the climate crisis, and to actually not just make system change a slogan to hold onto our banners, but actually to bring it to our fore into our day-to-day work, wherever we are, in our trade unions, in our colleges, in our workplaces, and actually build the kind of movement that we need, because this is a fight, it's a life and death fight, and it's one we have to be on the right side of justice.
Asad, and to all three of our fantastic speakers. If people can raise their hands again, and I'll call people in twos. I'm going to bring in the person at the back, so if the mic can go to the person at the back, and they'll be followed by the person at the back here. So if you're ready to speak afterwards.
Thanks very much. My name is Rehman. Thanks very much, Vanessa. Really inspiring. My question is, there were a couple of phrases mentioned which we hear again and again: revolutionary politics, system change. 1.5 degrees is the end. There is no hope of 1.5 degrees. And this is coming from leading scientists at the IPCC who speak to climate activists and tell us that 1.5 is not realistic, right? The crisis that we're facing is just beyond existential. And my question is it not now time to move beyond phrases such as system change and revolutionary politics and start talking about revolutionary action? And by revolutionary action, I mean direct action. I mean taking on the infrastructure that's causing this and saying this infrastructure needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. Whatever revolutionary action we need to engage in to end this, it needs to happen now.
The blue shirt on the middle row. Yep, you're on the, yeah, you're on the, no, that wasn't, yeah, behind, yep. After this comrade, can we bring the mic to the comrade at the front?
Yeah, great presentations. Mine is a question of land. In this country, especially in Britain, a lot of the land is enclosed. During the pandemic, we realized that there is no public space in this country because the whole economy is built around cities, cramped people, and stuff. There is only 3% of this country's land is open to public access. So if you're talking about climate crisis, when the crisis hit, the people who enclosed public land and took it as their private property and made money through selling people as slaves and bought those property and enclosed the land, we need to take it out from them. So it's a two-way system. There's a question of reparations under colonialism, under slavery. There's a question of also opening up the enclosed lands which were public lands which were stolen. They did not pay a dime for it. So if we want to avert future crisis, we should start now and dismantle the land ownership. When it started from the metropolis, the knock-on effect in other countries where it is beginning to take root would stop. So like in Ghana, Nigeria, where chiefs are starting to enclose public lands and give it to capitalists, would stop. So for me, that's one of the things to address the question of land ownership.
Okay, after the comrade at the front, I'm going to bring in the comrade with her hand raised and the mask down.
I come from South Africa. At the moment, we've got 100 municipalities which are unable to provide consistent running water for their citizens. We've got the third largest town, city in the country, formerly known as Port Elizabeth, where severe water rationing has been introduced, and in 2018 we came very close to the mother city, Cape Town. For that, alongside that, we have a situation where many of the maize crops production is being decreased, and that's throughout Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the staple, the wheat crops in further down in the south in my country are also now being severely under threat. We are facing what some people call a social and economic collapse. There's a whole school of thought around that, and that's what we're presently seeing. We've got an energy system which is because it's been based on coal-fired power stations and so on, that we've been managing to stop their renewal, the extension of their lives and so on. It's partly fed into the energy crisis where we've now got 4.5 hours at a time, twice a day, stage load 6 load shedding. Now, what we're doing, and it's great to see Fridays for Future call for a global climate strike on September 24th. And we've got to get behind that call, and we've got to get behind the call in the way some of our speakers spoke to today about bringing together these struggles. So we are demanding not only a scrap to any more expansion of fossil fuel production in our country, but access to land, access to energy, against the cost of living, protection against the cost of living and price rises and so on. And in that way, you know, bring meat to the idea, really, in many ways, which is introduced into the climate politics by Extinction Rebellion, making climate justice a movement of movements. Because, you know what, Andrew Mullen and how to blow up a pipeline is a good idea, but it's not going to build the resistance and the movement and the class politics we need to actually dislodge this system. Thank you.
So the comrade who's standing, and the final contribution I'm going to take is from the comrade at the back with the green shirt.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very, very impressive. And it is totally like, it's amazing, isn't it? Because in a way you should be massively depressed, but after those speeches you sort of feel totally inspired as well. So, and I think that's what happened at COP26. We knew that we were going to be a pile of crap, weren't they, at the top. But outside, everything happened, inspired us, and we loved it, and it made us all, it just raised awareness and raised our confidence. So why do you think they chose the next one, COP27, to be in Egypt? I've got a leaflet here, it was only composed yesterday, because I'm in the MENA Solidarity, Middle East and North Africa Solidarity campaign, which is sponsored by a few of the unions. And Egyptian activists contacted us and said, you have got to get a message out to people about what is happening in Egypt. Now, some loads of you will already know, that is a murderous, brutal regime where a generation of activists from the Arab Revolt are in prison. They're in prison now. It's 2011 to 13 they were in prison. It is absolutely brutal. But the General, Al-Sisi, he will use COP27 in order to greenwash his regime. There is environmental activism going on. You have to be very brave, and they suffer. The answer is always repression, and people are suffering. I was really pleased that all the climate presenters today, they talk in the present tense. It's not will happen, it's not there will be. It is a climate catastrophe. People are suffering now massively. So they have tried, and they have been repressed for it. So really, what they've asked us to do is bring a message here to say, don't let them greenwash. He will want it only to use finance any finance for renewables, whatever, will go straight in the hands of the military and the generals. As Asad pointed out, it goes straight, and Gyekye as well, straight into the hands of the people in power.
Can you begin some of please?
I will sum up, yes. So please get a leaflet from the Marine Solidarity stall. We haven't got many. So go on Egypt Solidarity Initiative. There is an Egyptian campaign for climate and democracy. So please follow it through Marine Solidarity. And we have to work out how we are going to get that message into our protests and our propaganda in the lead up to COP27. Thank you.
This will be our final contribution, I'm afraid, and we'll bring our speakers to sum up, so go ahead.
One of the things I think we have to point out is that it's not just that our rulers are doing nothing, they're actively making it worse. Look at the war in Ukraine. Look at the excuse of energy security. Suddenly all the limited measures around green energy go out the window and they're back to coal, gas and oil. Look at the net zero scrutiny group in the Tory party. They are trying to play up using cultural language to say that the reason working class people are suffering is because of green targets or commitments to net zero. Look at the Supreme Court decision. Not just the terrible one of Roe versus Wade. Look what came after. The Supreme Court saying that Biden's limited measures to cap emissions wouldn't be able to go through. All of those things show, I think, this is a system that can't be reasoned with. We can't make this a greener system. We can't make it fairer. They are dropping any pretense that climate catastrophe is not guaranteed in the future if this system continues. They're writing off the lives of millions of people, especially in the global south. And that means, I think, that for us, we have to think where the movement goes. Because the inspirational movement that has erupted since 2019, there's been big pressure from the system to channel it into safe spaces. Go and work for an NGO and come to COP. Go and be a councillor. Go and be an MP. Go and meet Barack Obama and all of that kind of stuff. We have to be the people who say, we want the movement to go into more dangerous places. We want more revolutionary action. The movement is strongest when it's on the streets, but crucially, like the panel talked about, when it's pushed into the working class movement. And I think that's a big, big task for us. We have to think how we deepen the movement and how we link the climate crisis with the cost of living crisis, with the crisis of the war of Ukraine, and the crisis of a system that can't be reasoned with.
Thanks everyone who contributed to that discussion, and I apologise to anyone who didn't get to speak. There were lots of people who didn't get to speak. We're slightly running over and really need to try to finish by 5. And obviously bring back our 2 speakers. Just some quick announcements before I start bringing back the speakers. First of all, Bookmarks Bookshop is going to be closing at 5:30. So if you want to get any radical books, like the ones at the front, we've got also here System Change, Not Climate Change. Then you can go outside to the bookshop. The shop will close at 5:30, so do make sure you do that before it does. As well, we'll also be having at 5:30 our closing rally to end the festival, really, where we're going to hear from people like Janet Alder, the Justice campaigner, and international speakers like Gyekye as well. So please join us in the Great Hall at 5:30 for the closing rally. That's going to be followed with an after party at Draper's Bar, which everyone is welcome to. I'm going to start in a different order. I'm going to bring back first Asad Rehman from War on Want.
Thank you. And thank you, comrades, for the different interventions. I want to just talk maybe on that point about the revolutionary action. I think for too long in the climate space, people have framed this conversation about theories of change, right? Where we really need to be thinking about theories of power and theories of struggle. And what does that mean? Well, it means, of course, we all understand movement of movements, but it's not simply about mobilising people, and that is important, putting them on our streets and showing our strength. It's about organising people. And to organise people, we know you need a vision. You need to be able to spell out the world in which we're trying to strive and fight for. And for too long, people have been scared to portray that. It said that neoliberalism's greatest victory has been the ability to take away our imagination, our ability to be able to imagine something different. And we have to rekindle that imagination by being able to describe the world that we're fighting for. And that does mean stopping this argument that the right use, this is all about less, and actually starting to talk about it being better. It's a better world we're fighting for, one that will bring better things for people in their day-to-day lives. And that means being more clear about our demands. And as War on Want, with our social movement partners, we have an idea of a radical global Green New Deal with these demands about tackling inequality and the climate crisis, making energy and food public goods, etc. And that does require us to have political education, right? I mean, there is an incredible amount of people coming into the movement, being aware now, conscious about climate. But how are we doing the political education to get them to understand? What does it mean when the climate strikers put up a banner and say, uproot the system? What system are we uprooting? And what are we replacing it with? That political education is really, really critical. And then, of course, thinking about what interventions we make and how we build that collective power. And it's absolutely that in this moment, if we are not connecting the cost of living crisis to the climate crisis, then we have lost it. You know, we all, I think you all remember the Gilets jaunes and the yellow vests, you know, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people worry about the end of the world. No, we have to be the people who worry about the end of the world and at the end of the month, because we know the solutions to both are exactly the same. And, you know, on the issue about land rights, absolutely. Look, this is fundamentally a critical issue. That's why if you want to solve the climate crisis, it's not possible without land rights. And all of these things go to the heart of tackling the capitalist system, which is why it finds it incompatible and impossible to be able to deal with it. It's impossible. If we want to stop deforestation, we know it's proven the best remedy to stopping deforestation is to give people land rights. It's to give indigenous and forest-dwelling communities land rights. And why can't they? Because, of course, that changes the control of power. And that's what is at the heart of course, this capitalist system. Now, on the reparations, you know, at the COP27, there's going to be another conversation about loss and damage and about the global goal for adaptation. And as you said, it's incredible. They made a promise in 2009, plucked it out of thin air, Hillary Clinton, $100 billion a year, not being able to meet that. But we know the scale of the transformation that's required is in the scale of trillions. Well, you know what? We have an answer. In fact, they've shown us what the answer is. Because if they can seize the assets of the Russian oligarchs, them are the billionaires. Why don't we seize the assets of the billionaire class? The billionaire class who last year increased their wealth by $16 trillion alone, at the same time as working class people lost income of $13 trillion. That's where the wealth is. If you can seize Russian assets of companies, well, let's seize the assets of the industrial food system companies, of the fossil fuel companies, and let's actually bring them into public control so we can have a real justice transition. Not just a just transition for the workers based in those governments, but a justice transition that recognises the importance for workers all around the world. Yeah? And, you know, and there are immense hope. I know in this moment of it looks like real doom sometimes, and we have to avoid doomism, right? That there's nothing we can do. And that's important, the stories we tell, right? So in South Africa, as Rehman had said, well, look, the shack dwellers, the most repressed movement in South Africa, whose leaders are regularly assassinated, has a poor people's campaign, connecting grassroots movements, talking about the neoliberal system, fighting for the right to energy, but the right to housing, and connecting it to living economies and having an analysis of in Chile, you know, we remember the cradle of neoliberalism, and now they're saying it's going to be the graveyard of neoliberalism. Why? Not because of some great NGO or something, it's because movements came together, took to the streets, organised and won. And in Colombia, just 2 weeks ago, the Colombian election, how did they win? They won it by building movements, social movements that connected workers and environmental justice, indigenous and movements. Everywhere in the world, there is resistance. We've got to lift up that resistance, and we've got to show solidarity with that resistance. So absolutely really important that when we talk about COP27, we do show solidarity with the Egyptian movements and Egyptian activists, because they are absolutely repressed, and the movements now around COP27 are exactly trying to do that. How do we use the COP27 to also get our own comrades out of prison? How do we use the spotlight on Egypt to actually have some material benefit for the Egyptian movements as well? Look, the one thing that is really, really important if we're going to win is we know you cannot win this without the labour movement, right? Whether it's the labour movement being set against us in an argument that jobs versus justice versus climate, or when we want to build power. And that really does mean that all of us who are in trade unions really need to go back into trade unions and win arguments about a justice transition. And that means about transition in the next decade, not in 30 years' time, because as we all know, we do believe in workers of the world united. We're not interested in just British workers. We're interested in workers all around the world. And that means we have got to be the people who bring the internationalism and the justice argument into that space.
Next to sum up will be Suzanne Jeffries from Campaign Against Climate Change.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia, and to Asad. All of what Asad said, I agree with. Just so maybe to add a few other things. Riyadh spoke about South Africa and how increasingly people are talking about social and economic collapse, societal collapse. If you turn your attention to what's happening in Libya at this moment in time, you kind of have a little bit of a glimpse into what that looks like. So there are what the media are calling riots on the streets of Libya and fear in the eyes of lots of global leaders about what's happening. I think we might call it, an attempt by ordinary people to assert power, to take to the streets, to demonstrate. What have the Libyan people been facing? They've been facing 18-hour-a-day power cuts. This is in a country that is rich in fuel reserves. You have the wealthy who have been stockpiling fuel and trading it away from ordinary people, and you have the impact of the food crisis that we've spoken about earlier. Now, that's the reality of what the system collapse looks like as we speak, and that's in addition to the other things that people have spoken about, that Gyekye spoke about earlier, in terms of what it looks like for populations globally, and particularly impacted in certain populations, which is why I think it's so important what we do when we mobilise for Egypt, when we mobilise for COP27. So we have to keep that kind of, we're operating in a different situation. COP26, we mobilised a really impressive movement, and so much was learned from each other, and we organised on the streets, we built solidarity, etc. We're organising in a different context as we come to Egypt. We're organising in an even more extreme climate crisis, but we're also organising in the context of a global cost of living crisis, food crisis, and the attempt to respond to those by governments around the world with repression, with reasserting the redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, etc. And that's the context in which we mobilise, and they therefore mean that our demands have to be matched up to that moment. They have to be greater. They have to be demands that are focused on system change in the way that other people have spoken about. I just want to finish, and therefore our focus on Egypt should be, I'm always in favour of mobilising around COPs, not because we know or believe that what they do behind closed doors is going to change anything. It hasn't, it doesn't. But it gives us an opportunity to build the kind of movements that we need, and it gives us an opportunity to call out their failure and to pose and demand and build the kind of programs that we actually can and do need to make those change. So when we mobilise for Egypt, all of the things that you spoke about, we have to absolutely put front and centre, as well as the wider context in which we mobilise. So I just want to finish on this. I think your question about moving from slogans to revolutionary action, I think that's all absolutely right. And the urgency that you speak about, 1.5, we are living in a world in which our societies will collapse. And we are posed with that question of how do we resolve the barbarism that capitalism has confronted us with. I think there will be direct action. I don't think that, there's no question about it. Out of that urgency, people will attempt to stop the infrastructure from being developed, etc., etc. I would say, however, if we are to, there's no shortcut. Stopping infrastructure, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, all important. We saw that in terms of the anti-fracking movement. But there isn't a shortcut, unfortunately. It doesn't change everything. There isn't a shortcut to building the kind of mass revolutionary action that we need to transform our society. Because we need to stop the infrastructure, but we also need a huge revolutionary reconstruction of society. And to achieve a revolutionary reconstruction of society is about building mass movements based on the power that we have as the majority in society to challenge the power of the minority in society. And unfortunately, there isn't a shortcut to that. But we are opened up with some really, really important opportunities, as people have spoken about. together to really deepen and speed up the chance of building those kind of movements. And therefore, we do have to go from the big to the small and back into our workplaces, back into our communities, back into our trade unions, and make sure that we're not operating in silos, that we build in centrally the demands to tackle and create a climate justice at the heart of the mass movements that develop around pay, around workplace conditions, etc., and vice versa in terms of the climate movement. It's hard to hold on to hope, but we do have to hold on to hope because we have absolutely no choice, and we do know we can look at the past and we can see there are moments when change has come, and we have to make sure that we live in that generation and create that change now.
Gyekye, sum up.
All right, comments excellent from everybody, and definitely I think that the two comments have hit many nails on the head. In African English, we say severally in terms of the my comments. You know what? I also want to take up the question of agency. I really like what the comment at the back said about revolutionary action, but I think that we also have to have movements that are diverse enough to encompass the capacities to act and exercise the power that the range of working class people have. If you are in Sri Lanka today, where you have to buy kerosene, queue for hours or days, and buy kerosene half a cup at the cost of your monthly pay, your first point of call is to go about blowing up the infrastructure of the oil, the petroleum pipelines coming up. I'm not denying the relevance and legitimacy of what you're saying. I'm simply saying that it has to be tied to and contextualized within that element of system change. If you're fighting the cost of living crisis in Sri Lanka, where you want the fossil fuel importers and refiners and so on, their profits to be taken over and transferred to subsidize energy and fuel for working people, you need to be able to exercise the power of working people to go to work, to take it over, to strike, to link, supply the communities, and so on and so forth. You may even transform those pipelines to a better, more sustainable use, if it is possible. I don't know, 10 plows to whatever, saws to plowshares and all that kind of thing. Well, we have those options as well. So in other words, we cannot choose the methods that will render a majority of people on the sidelines as passive watchers. It's a bit like guerrilla war. Who doesn't like Che Guevara? I know I do. Well, up to a point. But the fact is that type of heroism or that type of attempt to do something spectacular that will inspire and excite, of course it has a place. But it has a way of setting aside not just the agency of a lot of people, it also has a way of creating doubt in people's minds about what then is to replace it. Because if we need system change, then we have to have answers systemically. We have to have answers to the question of capitalism. I know the comment here, I know what he meant by this is not an ideological fight, in the sense that even elements of the ruling class are saying, but to be honest, it is. In fact, he came back to say that it is. Political education and so on and so forth. But the ideological fight and the building of movements has to understand where this question of power that all of us have raised, how is it configured, where does it reside, what is the basis of the capacity to transform it? And for that, comrades, streets, communities, colleges, all absolutely critical. But the power of the organized working class at the center of that is irreplaceable. We do not say it to be sectarian. That's why I started off with saying about the importance of radical reforms, the importance of revolutionaries working with those reforms, reformist movements in United Front organizations and so on and so forth. But if socialists in the left are to bring a dimension that will transform ordinary people's capacity to fight back, that will give people a sense of where to go, then I think we will be shirking in our duty somewhat. If we are afraid to pose our politics for fear that simply by saying it, we're being sectarian. People are fucking dying in the thousands. And those people have to recognize that the power that they have to overturn the system, they have to get off their knees and so on. No amount of moral preaching, heroism is going to change that. But if there are visible experiences of taking on the fact that I'm in Ukraine, I've been attacked by an imperialist force, my government is trying to switch our country to join another imperialist camp. Okay, I'm defending my country in terms of national defense, but I'm part of the local militia, like partisans were in Greece and so on and so forth. Part of the local militia who will overturn the land grab. That if you look at any of the material that is around the question in Ukraine, Oakland Institute is one website you can look at. For example, the land grabs, the concentration of monopolies in agriculture and so on. So all these are reasons why the crisis in the supply chain is there, not simply the military side to things as well. If we're taking that to ensure that by the time that we're able to resist, build up an anti-war resistance to bring this war to an end, by the time that we're able to ensure that that anti-war resistance take on an internationalist view, internationalist dimension, so that the things that we need from we controlling land and production in Ukraine, the same things we can negotiate with our sister and brother workers elsewhere, that kind of associated organization of free producers, the necessity of ensuring that there's democratic rights and so on and so forth, it is a totally different construct. You cannot fight the question of imperialism without looking at the question of climate change, as people say. But then again, you cannot rely on the state to do that. Otherwise, you go Zelensky's way. He's happy to sell off, to fuel the land grab. He's happy for the power of oligarchs to be expanded, to be woven into the EU and so on and so forth. The class question is irrefutable. Whether you are in Sri Lanka, whether you are in Senegal, whether you are in Slovenia, whatever it is, this is the element that we have to look at. And socialists should not be in 1 minute embarrassed by saying that that power has to be mobilized. And for that power to be mobilized, you can't simply shout one day and it's mobilized. Ensuring that on a day-to-day basis, people have a crucible, have a place where their experiences of one another, their view of themselves, their understanding of the world is transformed, is necessity. So in addition to the movement, you need a revolutionary party. You need a revolutionary party alongside those climate justice hubs in the workplaces, in the communities, in the colleges, on the streets. You need a revolutionary party. So I will say, to strengthen the climate movement, to strengthen revolutionary climate action, to ensure that you have system change, join the SWP as well. Thank you, Corbyn.